You're listening to The Voluntary Life, where you can hear ideas for finding freedom in an unfree world. Visit thevoluntarylife.com to connect with the show and hear all past episodes. Here's your host, Jake.
Hi, it's Jake here. Welcome to The Voluntary Life. On this episode, we're going to be talking about unjobbing, and I'm very pleased to have a special guest. Welcome, James Davis.
Hey, Jake. Thanks so much, man. Happy to be on.
So we're chatting in a lovely New Hampshire afternoon, and you and I have got to know each other in the last few weeks since the festival, the Free Coast Festival that we were both at. And I thought it'd be interesting to talk to you about your very unconventional and interesting experience of unjobbing. Before we get into that, maybe you could just say a little bit about your background and where you come from and the kind of work that you've been doing.
Yeah, sure. So I went to college actually to be a high school English teacher, and I was planning on going right into teaching, but my girlfriend then and now wife Taylor, she was going to teach too, except she was a year younger than I was. And so at my senior year at university, I started to play poker online, mostly just to mess around and do something at night after I had been out drinking and so on. And eventually I started to get pretty good at it and started to make a little bit of money at it. And then a really key moment was when one of my best friends told me that poker is a nice thing to do as a hobby, but no one could ever make a living at it. So I took that as a challenge and decided that while my wife was going to be back at university for her senior year, that I would see if I could spend a year only making money playing poker. And so I did that. I moved in with my parents to start. And then in that first year, I made way more money than I ever could have made teaching. And then it just became... it would be a huge financial sacrifice to walk away from poker at that point and go back into teaching. So I decided to stick with it. And my wife actually delayed teaching. And then we basically started traveling around and living off of online poker and skiing and just kind of goofing off for a few years. Yeah.
Right. And I want to ask you more about making a living from poker, but because I know that before we get into that in more detail, I know that you have done also lots of other more entrepreneurial things as well. Yeah. Have you ever had a regular job?
Yes. So I'll give you the longer tail version. So after I played poker for a couple of years, my wife and I would head back to New Jersey every summer to work at the summer camp where we first met. And so I would play poker, say 10 months a year, and then I would go work and then eventually just volunteer at this summer camp. And I did that for a number of years. I tried to start a few different online businesses in the continuing education poker space. Basically just entrepreneurial startups, videos, kind of like, YouTube for people trying to learn how to play poker and that kind of thing. And then when the United States government came and outlawed banks from doing business with offshore poker companies, that really shook up our financial situation because I could still have played poker, but like the business opportunities that we had pursued were totally up in smoke because so many of the casual players were having difficulty getting money on and offline. And I started to think about other things. And so at that time, we had just had our first son. And, you and I have talked about the parenting thing a number of times. But one of the things that we started to get really excited about was this new idea of working with kids. So, how do we work with kids in a more honorable, a more open way to help them be more self-directed and become more self-actualized and involve less force in our parenting and that kind of thing. And so we wanted to start a school at first, and then we realized that there were just mountains of red tape involved with that. So we thought we would try a camp instead. So I actually did apply to be the executive director of a nonprofit summer camp that was sort of failing with the pitch that I would work at way under, value. I think I took a 90 or 95% pay decrease to go from poker to working at camp. But that was a conventional job, even if the scenario was sort of irregular. So I went there and I worked there for 3.5 years as their executive director, kind of figuring out if our ideas about working with kids were something we really believed, if both qualitatively it was going to have good results and would be good business practice. And then when we had overwhelming success with that, that's when I really got into the, mixed income sort of unjobbing environment. I started doing consulting with camps. I started doing public speaking around the country. I created another business that was basically continuing education, kind of like my old poker site, but for camp directors instead. So videos on how to run camp better, resources, how to create better games, interact with kids better, that sort of thing. And then alongside that, we launched another business in the data analytics space for fantasy sports players. So at that point, I think once I left camp, I realized that it gave me a newfound confidence that basically there were just a certain core set of principles and ideas that you can apply to any number of different business pursuits, right? Whether it's speaking or consulting or fantasy sports or whatever. And if you really get those principles down, if you understand how to interact with customers, if you understand how to create value, how to communicate that you've created value, and that sort of thing, that's actually around the time I started listening to The Voluntary Life too. And I just realized, why don't I just try 15 different things and see which one fits the best, So yeah, that kind of leads us up to last year, pretty much. That's basically what I did from 2013 until then.
So I would say that, in fact, even that period that you were in full-time employment was an unusual job, because you were taking a failing business, and also, you had a very kind of leadership-oriented role. So it wasn't your typical job,
No, not really. I mean, at first it looked more like that. And basically, I think to harken back to, I don't want to sound like the biggest Voluntary Life fanboy ever, but I harken back to something you talked about negotiation-wise in terms of looking for a job. And one of the things we did when negotiating the position in the first place was think about what was really important to us, my wife Taylor and I. And the thing that I think was most important was that we would get to try this big idea we had. And we really wanted to see what could happen if we brought kids together and just let them do whatever they want. That was kind of the hypothesis we wanted to test. And for most camps, they don't have any interest in letting you do that. Understandably, they have their own mission and their own vision and their own financial goals and so on. But since this camp had 6 months worth of runway, but since we had so much money saved up from poker, I didn't need, what my contemporaries were getting salary-wise. So I came and said, hey, why don't I come and I think I took like $25,000 or something the first year, which again is not really a living wage, but we had a little house we could live on the property. And I said, hey, if you pay me this small amount of money and then build in incentives where, if the camp is profitable and, we are making money and reinvesting into the property, that I'll get paid more commensurate with my skills. If we're able to do that, then everyone will be happy, right? And so they're thinking, well, this is all monopoly money. This camp's going to fail anyway. So sure, take whatever future money you want if you're willing to work for next to nothing now. And so we did, and everyone felt great about it. It was a really great negotiation from that perspective. And then what it did was guarantee me full creative control over the organization, because a lot of times, especially when you're working in not-for-profits or any organization with a board or a huge governing body, it's just super slow, and it's really difficult for anyone to even decide what we're supposed to be doing, much less how to get things done. And so given that they were willing to give that to me, I did get to sort of be like an entrepreneur, an entrepreneur within that organization. And that to me was vital. I wasn't just going to go and, work for them and their vision that was already failing,
Right.
That wasn't filling me up at all.
Well, what I find really interesting about the things that you've done is that this is all unconventional, the things that you've done. It's all sort of like stuff that you found a way to make money and do it in a way that is fun and interesting, and also done things that are really meaningful to you. What I'm interested in is your own journey and the psychological side of doing that. Because, for example, making money as a poker player, that is an unconventional way to make money. And so I'm curious about, when you started doing that, what did other people think of what you were doing? What did you think of what you were doing? And what was the psychological side like of finding a way to make money in such an unconventional way?
Yeah, there was a lot to that. I think on one hand, I was excited by it because I'd always liked playing games and, competing. Those were two things that I really loved doing growing up. But I also felt a lot of conflicted feelings, as weird as it might sound. Coming out of college and making a 6-figure salary, playing games would have been my biggest fantasy in high school or something. But you start to get all these messages from different avenues in your life. Like I talked to you about that good friend of mine who told me that poker wasn't something you did as a job. Now, part of it was because he didn't think it was feasible, but it was also like not quite serious enough.
Right.
It wasn't like grown up enough or something. And as someone who, did pretty well in school and was doing well in college and, was well liked by my professors and employers and that kind of thing, I think a very frequent piece of feedback I got was that almost people were a little disappointed, like they were like, oh, this is what you're doing with these gifts you have or whatever. And you're really just going to sit around playing poker and going to Atlantic City and Las Vegas and doing that kind of thing. And they were disappointed. And that led to even feelings of guilt in myself, even though I was doing something and, even rationally I could view like, well, this is actually making it so I only have to work 8 or 9 months a year. And then I can go, and I was volunteering at the camp and basically giving them back several $1,000s in what would have been my wages during that time. and sitting on the board and even donating back to the camp. We had a big capital campaign where I was able to donate back. And even though I was still doing things I cared about, volunteering an after school program, stuff like that, I still felt guilty, like I was wasting my gifts. This is something I struggled with a lot for probably the first 3 or 4 years that I did this. And it just took so much evidence for me that I was actually not turning into a bad person, because also growing up in New Jersey, which was very leftist and, very socialist in a lot of ways, you're taught that doing things just for financial gain is sort of wrong. Right. And that's what I believed too. And so I think a lot of what I was doing, in terms of philanthropy and that kind of thing was almost out of guilt rather than out of the joy of giving. And so from that perspective, it was not a very healthy mentality. It's just that the evidence of how much money was coming in was too overwhelming to walk away from. Like, I think still the logical part of my brain was telling me, well, you'd be nuts to go do the other thing. Like, you can't just go teach for $40,000 a year when you're going to be able to provide for yourself and for your family for a number of years, And so I worked through it. And I think I worked from, initially those feelings of guilt to eventually settling, especially when we bought our first house. We bought a house in a well-to-do neighborhood in New Jersey, not too far from my parents. We were pretty settled in on, giving back, and it was feeling good to contribute to the world in ways beyond just playing poker, because poker doesn't really create value. It's just playing a game against people. And I was starting to get into the entrepreneurial pursuits, and I think I started to gain more confidence, to feel more comfortable doing something that's just pretty unusual, And so I think, that initial confidence period, though, and hearing from everyone, not only that it was kind of a waste, but also that it was probably going to fail. Even when I was making a lot of money, people were always like, the first time I would interact with someone, they were always waiting for that other shoe to drop. And I'm not sure why, but they always assumed that at some point I was going to come out and be like, hey, sorry, everyone, it didn't work, and that was a weird feeling too, kind of people waiting for you to fail.
Yeah. So I'm guessing that you had a lot of friends who were in college with you and then were pursuing more traditional careers and, working their way up the career ladder and so forth. And I remember you saying that with poker, you actually didn't have to work that many hours a week anyway in order to make significantly more money than you would have been making if you'd been on a career thing. So was it weird having a lifestyle that was so different from your friends?
It was. I was working there at first, that first year when my wife was still in school, I worked a ton. I probably played poker 10 or 12 hours a day, a lot of poker. I had nothing else to do. I was at my parents' house, so I would travel or I would play online or do something like that. But very quickly, that was it was fortuitous timing, because that's right before poker sort of took off in the US. It was on ESPN and the big cable networks, and the sizes of the prize pools went way up. And since I already had a skill set for it and had been interacting with really brilliant people who just happened to like this game before that, all of a sudden I went from working 50 hours a week to 30. And then by the end, I was working 15 or something, partially because I was bored, but partially because the money was just good enough that I didn't have to do that other stuff. And so that really did affect my relationships with some friends. I would put them into two categories. The friends I still have now, so if they're listening out there, you'll know that you passed this test. But the friends that I still have now, the people that I realized I needed to keep in my life, were the people that genuinely were rooting for me to succeed, And I've noticed this in entrepreneurial ventures too. One of the biggest issues I've seen in new entrepreneurs, I guess I'm somewhat seasoned now after doing it for, the better part of a decade. But one of the biggest things I see in new entrepreneurs is this kind of heavy weight of maybe their spouse, maybe their parents, maybe other loved ones or friends in their lives, kind of just expecting that they'll fail. And in some cases, I felt like people maybe were even rooting for me to fail, because part of that is I picture this. So I went to and did student teaching, and many of the people I student taught with went right into teaching. And when they come and interact with you and they say, what school are you at now? And you say, well, I'm not out of school. I'm playing poker for a living. That causes a period of reflection in them, right? Because at first we were all going to go and just start teaching. That's was the safe option. And we were all going to take that together. We never said that, but that was what everyone assumed. And so when you're not doing that, then some percentage of people are going to think, well, why isn't James doing what everyone else is doing? Does he think he's better than us? Or, does he, why? And they don't really want to ask themselves, should I be doing that too? They want to find reasons why it's not the right thing to try this new and unusual thing, And at first I tried to be as empathetic as I could to those sorts of things, but I actually think that I created a dynamic with those people where they felt like it was like funny to joke about me kind of like wasting my talents or, taking all these risks or, like you're going to go broke and have to sell your house. Ha ha ha, stuff like that. And I think at some point you realize it's just exhausting to spend time with people who either don't believe in your ability to succeed or don't want to, And so it did put a big strain on the relationships, on some of my relationships with people that were doing more conventional things. Now, many of my friends were doing conventional things, and it's interesting. We maintained a great relationship, and they would come and we would all hang out at our house and they would talk and we would spend time together. But 10 years later, many of those people now who are rooting for me to succeed, many of them are doing really interesting entrepreneurial things with their own lives.
Right.
I think they were actually able to look at it for inspiration, I hope to say humbly, but just to see that it was possible more, and could take on that possibility. And so it deeply enriched those relationships. Like one of those was my best friend at the time. He and I started our fantasy sports company that now pays the vast majority of both of our bills. And he actually walked away from a full-time teaching gig because he saw the possibility and believed in it, versus other people who are more critical that are still doing the same things they were doing 10 years ago. And that's fine if that's what people want to choose. But, it just caused us to drift apart.
So it sounds like you did, like some relationships didn't survive as you get older and see people taking different paths and you taking different paths. And that happens to people. That's happened to me as well. I'm curious to hear, I've got lots of questions about your poker career because this thing is very interesting. And I'm definitely curious to hear more about the psychological side. So I'm going to ask you more about that. But first of all, I'm really interested to hear two things. One, can you explain what was the appeal of poker? Because it sounds like it was like a puzzle for you to solve. And secondly, how did you make money doing poker?
Well, so at first it was a game. I've always loved games, like I mentioned. And I liked poker because it was a really hard game. Most things are not hard because people don't take them very seriously. And so if you're playing, like, I guess I've always been the type where I play a board game with my family around the house, and then I spend the next 3 days just walking the dog or lying in bed before night, just thinking about ways I could have been better at it.
Right.
And I realized that that's kind of like a way of being that I've always had. And for poker, it translated into making more money. And this was the first time, right? Because beating your friends even worse at Monopoly or something isn't really very satisfying. Like I was an excellent ping pong player growing up, but you can only destroy your friends at ping pong so many times before it gets boring, So you start to play left-handed, or maybe you try to find tournaments, but since there aren't a critical mass of people taking the game seriously, it stops becoming fulfilling. But with poker, it wasn't that way. Actually, in the early 2000s, when I first started playing, there was a small community of online poker players. There were these truly brilliant guys. Many of them are now leaders in their fields in various things. But, one guy, Nate Silver, is like a household name in the political projection realm. He's, on CNN and all these places, and redefined not only baseball projection, but redefined political projections and forecasting presidential races. And he's on Dan Rather, super well-known, brilliant guy. And he was just like one of our gang of people.
Right.
And not to brag about having known Nate and having his AIM instant messenger handle, but it was more like that was the quality of intellectuals I was interacting with, and they were unusual people wasting their gifts just like me, just to play a game and get better at it. But we were just making a ton of money. And so the combination of both of those things, interacting with brilliant people that had a lot of really interesting ways of looking at the world, and also making a bunch of money, the combination of both of those things was enough to keep me going until it stopped being as interesting, And when it stopped being as interesting, but the money was still good, it's like the rest of my life is so fun that, I was skiing 50 or 60 days a week and going to volunteer at camp, and kind of the way that the money showed up was almost immaterial. Like I still enjoyed it. I still enjoyed being good at it. And then we would scratch the itch by starting the businesses. And there were multiple ways to kind of keep it fresh. And then eventually there weren't. But so I think that was really it. It was the combination of it being fun, smart people, and then making a bunch of money.
And you were telling me the other day that the way that you approached it was that your strategy was essentially to work out small optimizations.
Yeah, exactly.
Can you explain a bit more about that?
Sure, because this wound up being, whenever you do something for a long period of time, and I know you mentioned in the things that you've developed deep expertise at, you've noticed this phenomenon as well, where as you go super deep in any field, you start to see things that are applicable or even super relevant in other areas of your life, but they don't happen to be the primary focus. And so poker is really interesting because most people's conception of poker is as this abstract singular thing. It's like sitting down and playing a card game. But what happens when you play it and try to become an expert at it is that you realize it's actually just a series of granular decisions, many of which repeat themselves or some version of themselves many, many, many times. I mean, I think by the time it was all said and done, I had played more than 3 million hands of poker or something like that, online and live. So a lot of hands of poker. And poker's just not that dynamic a game where things are always fresh. And so what we realized, our little group of people studying the game, was that certain decisions were extremely important and they would come up very frequently. And you had to start by getting excellent at those decisions. And so for people who've played poker, it's like which hands you decide to come into the pot with, your starting hand. And so if you get really good at that decision, you separate yourself from 60% of the field, right? Now, the next level of decisions might be something like figuring out what to do when you want to go all in and there's cards yet to come. So figuring out odds and probability, right? Basic stuff. And once you figure out, you get a really firm grip on odds and probability, you can kind of move yourself past the next 10% of the field, right? And so the decisions as you go on become more nuanced and more difficult to figure out, and they give you an advantage over a smaller percentage of the field, right? But as you continue to try to, in sort of a parabolic way, work your way up towards expertise, getting better and better and better, you find more interesting but less important decisions. But once you cross the threshold of now I'm making enough good decisions, you're making money. And poker has this really obvious switch that flips when you're winning or losing, right? Because last week you were losing because you weren't making quite enough good decisions. Then you figured out a few more good decisions you could make, and now you're making money. And everything from there is just increasing your profits. And so after being in this world pretty much only for so many years and transitioning into camp, I sat down at the table and realized I was just back to learning poker again. It was like, well, what are the most important things? Well, it's reaching out to all the people who came to camp last year. And if I can be the best at getting those people to come back, then I'll be ahead of most of the field, right? And you kind of, it's a system of prioritization really above anything else. And recognizing that there are a lot of things that matter, but you have to focus on the most important things first. And if you get really good at those, they'll repeat themselves over and over if you've correctly identified what's important. And then after that, once you get so good at those things that it becomes second nature, then you'll notice other sorts of decisions that you didn't even realize were decisions, right? And that kind of framework or that lens for looking at the world was how I could do everything. It was this superpower for not only running business, but my personal relationships or, self-betterment or entrepreneurship or whatever. And so all of a sudden, just because that was the only way to do poker, it became a way that now I live my life with other things. And so I just try to use that same methodology and it sounds weird or like kind of stilted, but even for like interacting with strangers, even for stuff that I had sort of a fixed mentality about. We talked about when we were hanging out the other day, kind of the Myers-Briggs, like where are you on the spectrum? I'm absolutely a natural introvert, but I have learned to master some of the better parts of extroversion, or not master, that's a really strong term, but I've gotten so much better at that because I was like, well, what are the biggest changes I can make that would have the biggest difference?
Right. I think what's really interesting is that gives a very good insight into what it's like being inside the mind of somebody who's approaching poker in the way that you were, where it's like an intellectual game and you're thinking about little optimizations and you're trying to think about this as a puzzle that you're solving. And I think there's a strong contrast between that and what poker players look like in the kind of mainstream culture from the outside, which is probably more like, people with too much cash to burn who are just going to like throw it all recklessly on a game or something like that, I think there's a strong contrast between what was going on inside your inner world and what the culture thought of what it was that you were doing.
Yeah, that's spot on. And I think a lot of people actually do approach it that way. And I think I've noticed that in every discipline of my life, actually, that there are people that take something really seriously and those people position themselves for success. And I'm not just talking business. I mean, parenting, again, interpersonal relationships, activism, and correctly identifying the most important things. Some people do this by accident, right? So some of those poker players that you see on TV, like I've played with, I would say most of the most famous poker players in the world, and many of them aren't terrific at the little nuanced things all the way out on the edges, but they're so good at the things that really matter the most that they can get by, right? They still cross the thresholds. One of the arguably the most important skill in poker, for instance, is who you play against, because the old adage goes, if you're the 10th best player in the world, but you play with the 9 guys in front of you, then you're the worst. You're going to lose, right? You're the worst player at the table, so you're actually just a losing player. And so there are some people who are terrible at the finer points, the odds and whatever, but they know how to get themselves into good games, or they know how to make a game more fun by being fun and helping everyone loosen up. So there are a lot of different ways to win at poker. And there's one way that I figured out how to do it, which was to approach it in this really granular way. But actually, one of the really interesting benefits of reaching the highest levels of poker was meeting those people with cash to burn, because what you find in the world usually is that you don't get cash to burn unless you know how to do something well. Right. So I remember meeting this one guy who was a terrible poker player. He was like one of the worst players in Atlantic City, and he would come and burn, $5,000, $10,000, $15,000 a weekend, and everyone just made fun of the guy behind his back. Oh, that guy's an idiot. His name was Tony. Tony's an idiot. That guy's an idiot, whatever. And everyone assumed that he was just this stupid dullard who came. And then I got to thinking, well, how does this idiot come and just lose $20,000 or $30,000 a month playing poker? And so one day I just decided to talk to Tony when we were over getting hot dogs at the little thing, and I just asked him about himself, because he didn't really talk much. And he said, oh, yeah, and he's not an old guy, he's in his 50s. He said, yeah, I'm in real estate, I guess you would say, commercial real estate. He didn't really want to talk about it. He just thought it was kind of boring. And as I kept pulling on threads, I realized that this guy was probably worth $500 million in terms of all the commercial real estate that he had owned all along the eastern seaboard there in the Jersey Shore and other places. And he had just been excellent at analyzing real estate deals and figuring all that out, and done it. He was a huge entrepreneur, done most of this in his 20s and 30s, and had basically been retired since he was 40, and just had way more money, wasn't married, and just had nothing to do. So he was a brilliant guy, super smart, but didn't care about poker that much, but whatever. So, but it really opened my eyes up to, first of all, just because you get great at something doesn't mean the people who aren't great at what you're great at, it doesn't mean they're stupid.
Yes. Yeah.
And you need to maintain humility just because you've achieved expertise in some small niche of the world. And then also there were so many brilliant people to learn from, and I think meeting him and meeting other people like him actually got me into podcasting, incidentally, because I was like, well, what else don't I know? I've just been sitting here thinking I'm the best and the most brilliant person ever because I made some money playing poker, and turns out I just don't know anything about almost everything. So
that's a really interesting insight into that world. And I'm curious to ask you more about the psychological side, because I think there are a lot of clever people with interesting skills that could lead to ways of making a living that are outside the mainstream, but they would find it difficult, as I'm sure anyone would, going to some kind of party or something and someone saying, what do you do? And then saying, oh yeah, I make money by playing poker. Mm-hmm. And that because of the social challenge of living an unconventional lifestyle, what do you think made that not a problem for you?
Yeah, I'm not even sure it wasn't a problem for me at first. I think I was self-conscious about it. And for some percentage of people, they're just going to think it's cool that you're playing poker. But in actually pretty glaring contrast, when I left camp, which was a super secure job, to go more of this really mixed unjobbing route, where none of my businesses were profitable enough to really sustain our family on their own merits, So I was doing the camp speaking stuff, but I was doing very little of it, a couple of talks a year for maybe a couple $1,000s total. We were running the continuing education campsite, which again made a few $1,000s a year, but nothing to write home about. And then the sports site, which at the time was making me, I can't even remember, but something like $3,000 a month. So again, fine. We were making a living and getting by, but we were like, renting a very modest house in this town and just kind of skirting by. And so people were looking at the old lifestyle because again, we achieved results at the camp and, we're doing well again, once again. And so walking away from a well-off and secure job, we lived at the camp. We had no expenses. We paid for our food and that was it over the course of the entire year. And so walking away from that into this new thing, I actually felt a lot less secure about being kind of an unjobber or a self-styled entrepreneur than I did about even playing poker. Because with poker, it was just too obvious. The money was there. Right. And so I was like, well, what do you want me to tell you? I'm just making a lot of money. So this is what I'm doing. But with the other thing, before it was an obvious success, I felt very awkward coming and being like, I don't know what I do for a living. I talk about camp and make a website about fantasy sports, and then people are like, oh, and they just assume you're like not a grown up, they're like, oh, this guy's kind of goofing off and he's, and his family's not even doing that well. You could see my house, you could see whatever. And that was very weird because until like moving here, especially, you kind of rewrite yourself as a brand new person. Like nobody here knew me or knows anything about me. And I don't want to sit around and brag about past successes or whatever. And so even though in past parts of my life, I was like considered one of the most successful among my friends, moving here, it was like, I didn't feel that way at all based on the stuff we were doing at the time. And I think I just needed to, again, regain confidence mostly around being self-directed, just choosing my own thing. And I don't really know that I had any big master plan other than to get used to saying it. I actually felt the temptation to not even totally say exactly what I was doing, kind of just deflect or be like, oh, I do some consulting or, just be as unspecific as possible because I wasn't proud of what I was doing or something, So yeah, no big helpful tips, unfortunately, other than I think what really got me through it is more being able to look in the mirror and believe that what I was doing was the right thing, even though it was hard to tell other people, to actually be able to know that me and my wife and that my kids, even knowing that they all believed in me and that I believed in myself, at least enough to do it, if not enough to really own it in public or something.
I think this is a really interesting topic. And one thing that occurs to me is that you do have a supportive relationship, and your wife, obviously, you've been together during the period when you were playing poker and when you were doing camps and when you were then doing unjobbing and various entrepreneurial stuff. And I think that presumably is a very important source of support, especially when some of these things that you've been doing are unconventional. So how did you find a relationship with somebody who was supportive of you making these unconventional choices, and how important has that been?
Yeah, it's been absolutely critical. I mean, the really nice thing, and not everyone has the benefit of doing this, but since Taylor and I have known each other since I was, had $200 to my name when I was 20, and now that I'm 35, we've known each other, I've been dating specifically a really long time by a lot of people's standards. And I think not that we ever explicitly laid out a contract or, made any handshake agreements, but it was always sort of understood for both of us that we wouldn't just settle for a life we didn't want, And so even directly out of college, when she had planned to go right into teaching, and, that was just had always been the plan, always for the year and a half or so that was leading up to that. Even then, we looked at each other and were like, well, should we do it now? And we've always had that really good rapport of being able to figure out things together. So instead, we said, hey, let's move out to California and just go ski. Let's just do it for a year and see how it feels, And that process of just checking in frequently, but maintaining total honesty and integrity around those discussions. Because one thing I've seen a lot when partners haven't been supportive of one another in entrepreneurship, because I have seen this, is if people aren't willing to take the risks together, it just doesn't work, because it was a risk, even though it worked out, poker could have not worked out. And we would have been in a much worse position if I had just wasted that year when she was still in school, or wasted the time afterwards, or if I hadn't been honest about how well it was going, because sometimes it didn't go well. And I would have to tell her, this month we lost a lot of money and here's what happened, and she would have to kind of be on board for those risks. And likewise for entrepreneurship, when we moved out here, and nothing was really settled, we made an agreement, we'll give this a shot for a year, and we're going to reassess the finances. And if it's not paying our bills or, leading to the lifestyle we want for our kids, then we'll reassess. And having those really clear definitions around what our expectations were really helped us, I think, just be on the same page. Because I think people get into a lot of trouble when there's a lack of specificity, both in, I've noticed this in employment, employing other people, or being employed, relationships with partners, everything else. When people try to make it up as they go along, or they say like, well, we'll figure it out. We'll see how we're doing. Like, no, you need, for us anyway, we've needed specifics. Well, if we're not making X a year from now, we'll look into employment that can pay us X if possible, And whenever we established those baselines, there was so much more comfort. So even when we moved out here and the businesses were providing something total like $40,000 a year, which wasn't very much money, we were still able to look and say, okay, we can make it through this year. Well, maybe we'll eat into some of our savings, but if we're able to make 60 next year, then we'll be fine. And if we can make 100, well, then we'll be great. And if we can make more than that, well, terrific. But she didn't need to worry halfway through that first year that I was going to come back to the table 6 months later and say, please give me another year, because we had made an agreement.
You made an agreement, right?
Yeah.
Right.
And so I think that leads to such a more supportive environment. And now it didn't need to be ironclad. We could have said, let's reassess in a year or whatever. But yeah, I think a lot of it fails when either both people don't share a vision or they just don't know what they're getting themselves into. And since we've always been able to, for whatever reason, be honest, like my wife's an entrepreneur too. She has her own businesses that have made all sorts of different amounts of money, and some have worked and some haven't and so on. But I think we've always just, I don't know, been understood that the most important thing for us anyway is that we wake up every day looking forward to doing what we're doing. And if we can survive, great. And if we can thrive, even better.
Yeah, I think that's really important. One of the kinds of feedback I get most from episodes on topics like minimalism or extreme saving and frugal living and travel, any of these sort of lifestyle choices, I get a lot of emails back from people saying, I'd like to do this, but my partner just is not interested. How do I convince my partner to, become a minimalist or go traveling or become an extreme saver? And it's really difficult, I think, because if you don't share the same vision, then if two people are working in different directions, it's going to lead to a lot of tension.
I think that's right. And I think for me, I would be... Well, there's an old poker saying, Jake, because I see everything through this lens, and it's called fold early and call late, which is basically the idea of don't invest in something that doesn't look like a good bet. And once you're deeper into something, then you want to be more aggressive about maintaining your interest in it. And I view relationships this way too. When my brothers would come to me in their early 20s and teens and things and say, hey, things are really not working out with this girl for whatever reason, I'd say, well, you should definitely break up then,
Yeah.
And that was totally opposite of everything they would hear elsewhere. They would hear, well, shouldn't I try and make it work? I'm like, no, you're 17. Definitely don't. If it's not working now, you don't. There's no baseline there, and that's always sounds easy to say for someone who's married and been with someone for a really long time. But there were plenty of people before that I just broke up with that wouldn't have been as supportive. And I think being really discerning in terms of whom we choose for partners when we're in the position to do that is absolutely vital for me, just to having a happy life in general. And I think also the path towards trying to change someone is so painful and mostly pointless. And it doesn't honor them as a person, and it doesn't honor you, I don't think either. And so not everyone's in the position to, or would even want to prioritize things like minimalism, say, because we've, taken on a lot of the principles of minimalism in our own personal life too, to great benefit and effect as well. But I think instead a position of honesty, which is to say, my priority is maintaining a relationship with this person, or my priority is minimalism. And if it's that important to you and you feel that calling so deeply, a really honest discussion with someone with the tears in your eyes and saying like, I think our life could be great if we just stopped buying junk every year, and really explaining that to someone could convince them that it's that important to you or not. And then you might decide, well, it is that important to me. And then you might do it. And that might be really painful and might be really terrible. But yeah, I think partners and the whole idea of partnership, I don't know, it's been so important to my life, but I would enter into an arrangement like that so cautiously if I ever did it again, because I just think about how much worse my life would be if I had been with someone who had told me 15 years ago, or I guess 13 years ago now, to just grow up and get a real job. I probably would have. And my life would have been so much worse.
Yeah.
So
I think that's a really, really good way of looking at it. Fold early and call late. Now, when thinking about other people who might have unconventional ideas for their own, not career, but their own path through work and making money, we talked about relationships and how important that is. I think another very important thing is, we talked about friends. Another very important thing is the expectations that your family have about getting a real job and, growing up and being responsible and so forth. Now, what's your experience of that, and how did that affect your decisions to go and play poker, for example?
I think the most valuable transition that I had in how I approached that was eventually just owning it completely and not making space for, if I didn't appreciate it, not making space for other people to poke fun or poke holes in my plans. And that might sound like defensive or, I don't know, like I was being too thin-skinned or something, but I find that the entrepreneurial spirit is just like, especially when you're doing it early on, And especially if you grow up in the US where nobody ever explains that this is even an option. Like it's, well, what job do you want to get someday? Do you want to be a doctor or a lawyer? Like it's never even a businessman, even a generic, business person that's off doing anything. And so when you start to get that first inkling towards entrepreneurship, it's just inside of you. And it's this tiny little thing that needs a lot of protecting and a lot of nourishment and a lot of encouragement. And in many cases, whatever your first ideas are will still fail. And that spirit of entrepreneurship it's getting weakened and weakened over time. And when you allow people to poke fun and to, tease you about this big plan you have or this big vision, or they tell you you're too utopian. We see this in libertarianism too. But when you let those voices creep in and you let your big dreams become the butt of a joke for too long, I think you start to think of them as a joke. And I don't think you need to be rude to anyone or too confrontational. But like for me with poker, I remember there was a family member in particular who I said, I'm just not really appreciating the jokes about the poker thing. This is something I'm working really hard at, and I'm trying my best to provide a living for me and my partner through this. And, it was before we had kids. And so I know it's really weird, and I know that makes a lot of people uncomfortable, but this is something that's really important to me, and just being vulnerable in that moment. And I just decided I would stop laughing uncomfortably and trying to change the subject, which I think is where a lot of entrepreneurs find themselves. Like, you're going to write a book, ha ha ha, like that kind of thing. And I just had to get that out there, because for me, how I was processing it, I was internalizing, and I was carrying all that weight of everyone thinking that my dreams were kind of a joke, because it wasn't as grown up. And so I think just owning it and being vulnerable with the people I care about, with the average people on the street, like you just take them or leave them. But for the people you really care about, I think it just makes sense to just come to them and really be confident that you're trying something. Acknowledge that it's scary. Acknowledge that it's risky, especially if there's someone who counts on you or depends on you, or who has a reasonable vested interest, like your parents. Your parents don't want you to be homeless in most cases, right? And so if they come, say, hey, I totally get why this is scary for you. It's scary for me too. I know this is unusual, but I have this thing inside of me that tells me I have to try this. So I'm trying it right now. And I would love your support, because if I get support from people around me, it's more likely to succeed. And I know it makes you a little uncomfortable. And if you just can't support it, I totally get it. But for me, this just kind of isn't like a laughing matter. That was so hard to say the first many times I said it. But once I got used to that, it kind of caught people back, and they were like, oh, they like never thought of it that way. Like their instinct, it's a very American instinct, I think, to joke when we're uncomfortable. And they could realize that it was actually their discomfort that was causing these kind of awkward, like it's not that funny to joke that someone's going to run out of money and be broke. That's not funny. It's not a good thing. But yeah, just knowing that that's how I was processing it. This isn't a joke to me. Let's leave it at that. That was really, really just a life changer for me. Just made all my relationships better. And for the people that couldn't take that seriously, they just moved on. And that was totally fine too.
It sounds like one of the things that happened for you was that you weren't doing sort of, if you like, the conventional thing that I think all of us have a sense when we're growing up, that there's some better careers to pursue that would be more in line with what our parents would think would be a good thing to do. And then there's things like playing poker, right? Yeah. And it sounds to me like what happened was that you basically confronted this discussion actually head on in terms of talking about it, rather than it being this uneasy thing that jokes were made, but there was a sort of weird undercurrent. It sounds like you brought it to the surface
eventually. But again, it took me years to get to that point, because again, early on I was insecure too. And when you're insecure and someone makes a joke about something you're insecure about, you don't usually have, at least I won't say about you, I don't usually have the confidence to speak up and advocate for myself. And once I decided that this is just what I was going to do, I needed to stop making space for other people to insert their 2 cents about how I was living my life. It's the only shot I get, and I know people care about me, but I just had to, because I noticed it was too great a strain on my relationship with people. And I've noticed this with other entrepreneurs I've known too, where like they have their big vision, but they don't have a supportive partner, or they don't have supportive parents. And I see the weight they carry around. And I would like to think that if those parents and those partners knew about it, if they were ever just shown video of how much this person was being vulnerable with me and struggling with me about, geez, I just really wish my husband would like believe in me, like I think if they knew that that's what that other person was feeling, they would stop. I really do. But I think in many cases, the person never advocates for themselves, and they just allow that to continue to be the narrative around their, what feels like a silly project, like when we started the fantasy sports company, I was doing that while working full time for like 2 or 3 hours in most cases after the kids went to bed, instead of hanging out with my wife and chatting with her and hanging out, right? And so she could have very reasonably looked at that and said, hey, like, pay attention to me. We're out here in the country. Like, why aren't we spending more time together, But since she and I were communicating honestly at that time, and she had seen what I had gone through with poker, she knew that I needed to scratch that itch. I needed to see if we could make it work. And I wouldn't have been able to do it while being tired, while working effectively what amounted to, again, 10 or 12-hour days between full-time work and making this side thing work as well. I could have never done it if I also had to sit there and worry, like, my wife doesn't believe in me, or she's worried that I'm going to squander our fortune, or, whatever else,
Do you have any suggestions or thoughts about what led you to realize that you needed to advocate for yourself in the way that you put it, for example, with your parents? Like, how did you come to the conclusion? How did you work through to the point where, rather than laughing nervously along with these jokes, that you actually did say that?
Yeah, well, actually, with my parents, I don't think we ever really had a discussion like that. And ultimately, they wound up being supportive again because they could see that my life was just going well. So I think once they got over the initial fear, like once you buy a house, it's hard to tell someone. I mean, now granted, that was right before all the housing prices crashed, and they didn't actually vet my finances very well. But once we are actually like had enough money, I think they were like, okay, we get it. This is weird, but it's fine.
I suppose with poker, that's the thing, is that you were obviously making a ton of money, and so it's kind of hard to argue when that comes in.
Yeah, but for other people, I think I realized that I have so little time for relationships in my life in general, and I think most of us don't. And for me, there are so few people, 10 or less, that I'm going to interact with on any sort of frequent basis, right? And if those people are going to be around me, I don't mind being by myself. Like I said, I'm a natural introvert. So if I'm just doing my own business or playing poker or whatever, I could just do that for a week or two at a time without really worrying about it too much. And so if people are going to be a part of my life, I think it was a combination for me thing. Like, I want this to be enjoyable for me, but also an empathetic thing toward them, which is to say, I really did think about, because I remember the first time I managed to work up the courage to say this to someone, their response wasn't defensive. It was, well, geez, I wish you would have told me sooner. Like, I didn't know. This was just like a way we always joked. And they felt terrible, And I started realizing there's probably more people in my life who also don't know that they're making me feel this way, or don't know that they're acting in a way that causes me to feel this way, and would love to change if they only had the information, And I think so many of us out there, if we really think about it, you're writing your big novel, you're launching your big business idea, very few people in your life are actually not believing in you as much as you think, but they don't know what to say, so you come to them. I had a conversation recently with a friend, and he's like, what's new? And I was like, well, we just bought a new camp and we're hiring a person, and in the meantime, this business and that business, and we hadn't talked in many years. And I said, and so what's new with you? And the person said, nothing, and this person, we're great. And it wasn't a sad thing, but it's like, when you're talking to people who don't often have much new going on, they don't really know how to respond to your next big kooky idea. Like I mentioned, we just bought a new camp, we just bought a camp. That's not something most people do. And so when I talk to you about it as an entrepreneur, you have all the questions. Well, who are you going to hire? How does this work? Did you buy the property or the business, right? But for someone who's not an entrepreneur, who's just been doing the same thing since they graduated college or whatever, they don't even know what to say. They're like, oh, okay. So why don't I just make a weird joke about it,
Right.
And I think that's the only, so I just try to say, yeah, it's not, I hear what you're saying. It's just not, not really in the mood to joke about it. It's like actually really important to me. So, and for, again, people that are in my life, they know that I communicate honestly now, if they're still around. So it's just fine, I guess, but it just takes courage and understanding that your friends and loved ones probably just want to know.
I think that's great. And I want to, well, actually, before we finish, I want to ask if you have any other thoughts for people who are interested in unjobbing, and who, not necessarily going to be doing anything like the things that you've been doing with poker or whatever, but have similar goals or interests that they could pursue and make money out of. What do you think are the most important lessons that you've learned that might be helpful for somebody to think about if they want to pursue an unconventional, unjobbing type life?
I think the first thing to understand is that there are a lot of people just like you who would love this lifestyle, but like you, if you're worried about starting, they're too worried to start. And so right away, just by simply taking the first step, hanging out your shingle, going on a website. Our mutual friend Roger recently tried to do voiceover work after talking to other mutual friend Stephanie Murphy. And so he just went out and hung out his shingle and just got a gig right away, and it's like, whoa, I didn't realize that this could be the thing. But most people in the world aren't thinking that way. So when they encounter someone like you, would be unjobber in the internet somewhere, they're going to be impressed by you. They're going to be not thinking that you're a fraud or a phony, which is, if you're like me, the story you might be telling yourself at first. They're going to think that you're impressive just by the fact that you're trying. And you are impressive just by the fact that you're trying. So that's the first thing, is that 90 million% of the people, almost everybody, never tries. They have a big business vision, a big dream, something they want to do on the side, landscaping, guitar lessons, whatever their thing is, and they never do it because they think it's silly or it won't work or whatever. And the next thing you should know is that at first it won't work. No one cares that people might be impressed with you, but very few people will pay you at first. Like when I started getting into the summer camp speaking circuit, had just been a camp director. Nobody cared who I was. There's thousands and thousands and thousands of camp directors. So what I did was I started writing about it online. I started sharing my ideas. When I started sharing my ideas, the other precious few people that were sharing ideas noticed, and they said, hey, we should share our ideas together. And so we did. When I started doing that, then people allowed me to come speak for free. And I would drive and at my own expense and speak for free. And when I did a good job with that, then I could go to the people who actually paid money and say, hey, look, I spoke at these other places and I've been writing, and then they took me seriously. And again, since basically no one takes those first steps, no one makes that initial upfront investment, then those people viewed me as credible and gave me a chance, and I needed to do a good job. I put everything into, I would pay people to help me make really good slides. I would, rehearse and really hit all my notes and, do all that kind of stuff. But I took that process really, really seriously. I treated it as seriously as I had while improving at poker or working at camp or anything else that I was really serious about getting good at. I didn't view it as a silly hobby. I wanted to make a career out of it. And I think that level of seriousness came through in my writing and my approach and the content I would create, but it also came through when I eventually delivered the product. And then the last thing, and this is a quote I think I got from a guy named Derek Halpern, who's just like an online business guru type. This quote really stuck with me before we launched the sports company several years ago, which is that every day you delay starting just delays your good years, which is to say, you're not going to start a business tomorrow and make any money, probably. Especially if you're doing stuff like I've done, largely online or, service-based work for people. It takes a lot of time, and sometimes less time than others. Like our sports business was profitable pretty reasonably so within 6 or 7 months, but other ones have taken years. And that's going to be true for almost any business you launch. So you can start today and have your good years 2 or 3 years from now, or you can start 6 months from now or have your good years 2.5 and 3.5 months from now, right? But not starting today is the very worst thing you can do if you hope for a lifestyle like this. And there are a million different resources you can look out there online to figure out how to get started, but just pick one and just actually take action. And if you do that, again, you'll be so far ahead of the curve. And I don't know, all I know is that it can be done alongside full-time work. It can be done alongside parenting. You just have to be honest with yourself. And the last piece is be honest with yourself about your priorities, because if this is not a priority for you, you won't do it. You'll be too tired. You'll sit around and watch Netflix at nighttime, or you'll go out drinking with your friends. And when I launched my businesses, I didn't do those things. I simply did not. And that's only because I have such a busy life otherwise. I could have done it when I played poker and was working 15 hours a week. But now as a full-time worker, I guess now I don't work quite full-time, but when I'm not working, I'm with my kids. And when they're asleep, I'm hanging out with my wife. And I have to prioritize something. And if you're prioritizing whatever recreational activity over starting a business, then you actually don't want a business. And so just decide, is this something you want? Because if it is, if you can listen to podcasts and you're that far along in the world, you can just do it. I just totally believe that. And if you do too, you will.
Brilliant. I think that's great. Where can people find out more about you if they're interested in following up on what you're up to?
I'm not sure you can find out more about me anywhere that would make sense to anyone out there. I mean, so some of the projects we're working on, if you want to check them out, might be interesting. The summer camp we founded, which I guess I never even mentioned, in 2014 when we left the old camp, that's called Camp Stomping Ground. You can check that out at campstompingground.org. The camp we just bought is called Longacre, You can check that out, longacre.com. And our sports business is DFSR.com. So those are the 3 projects I'm working on the most right now. If you want to check them out, if they're relevant to your interests, or you've got kids you want to send to camp, reach out. Otherwise, I'll understand. But if you really want to, email Jake, and then he'll connect us, I guess, would be the best way, because otherwise I'm not really on the internet that much.
Great. Thanks so much, James.
Yeah, man. Thank you so much. This is great.
Thank you for listening to The Voluntary Life. If you like this podcast, please show your support by becoming a patron of The Voluntary Life on Patreon. Your support will help to grow and improve the show, and you'll get access to a treasure trove of rewards, including bonus episodes. Visit thevoluntarylife.com to learn more.